The autumn wind swept across Boston Common, carrying with it the scent of fallen maple leaves and the distant aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. I stood at the edge of the pond, watching the swan boats glide silently across the dark water, their white forms ghost-like in the early evening mist. My hands were shoved deep into my coat pockets, fingers fidgeting with the small stress ball I always carried, a habit that most people found odd, but one that kept me grounded when the world felt too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. That's where I first saw her. Not in some romantic cafe on Newbury Street or during a chance encounter at Fenway Park. No, it was here, in this quiet corner of the Common, where the city's chaos seemed to fade into something manageable. She was sitting on a bench about 20 feet away, sketching something in a worn leather journal, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. What caught my attention wasn't her beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful. It was the way she moved, or rather, the way she didn't move. She sat perfectly still, absorbed in her work, oblivious to the joggers pounding past, the children shrieking with laughter, the sirens wailing in the distance on Tremont Street. In that moment, I recognized something in her that I'd spent 26 years trying to hide in myself. A kind of focused intensity that the world often labeled as antisocial or weird. But watching her there, pencil dancing across the page with precise, measured strokes, I saw it for what it really was: pure, unfiltered passion. My name is David Chin, and this is the story of the love I wasn't allowed to feel. Not because of race or religion or any of the usual barriers that tear people apart. No, this was different. This was about the invisible walls that society builds around people like me. People whose brains work differently, whose hearts beat to rhythms that others can't hear or understand. This is the story of how I learned to unmask myself, and in doing so, found a love more real than any I could have imagined behind the carefully constructed persona I'd worn for so long. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, in the city where cobblestone streets tell stories of revolution and resilience, where the Charles River winds through neighborhoods that have witnessed centuries of change, and where I learned that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of recognition between two souls who finally find the courage to be themselves. Boston in October is a city painted in fire. The maples along Commonwealth Avenue blaze orange and red, their leaves carpeting the sidewalks in a rustling tapestry that crunches underfoot. The air carries a crisp bite that makes you want to walk faster, pull your jacket tighter, find somewhere warm to escape the growing chill. For most people, it's a season of beauty and anticipation. For me, it had always been a season of anxiety. You see, autumn meant the return to routine after the relative freedom of summer. It meant longer hours at the tech company where I worked as a software engineer, hunched over lines of code in the glassy towers of the financial district. It meant navigating office holiday parties and family gatherings, events that required me to put on what I privately called my normal person mask. A carefully practiced persona that involved making eye contact, engaging in small talk, and pretending that the fluorescent lights didn't make my skin crawl or that the constant hum of conversation didn't feel like static electricity in my brain. I'd been masking for so long that sometimes I forgot where the performance ended and the real me began. My apartment in Cambridge, just off Harvard Square, was my sanctuary, a carefully organized space where everything had its place and the lighting was soft and warm. My neighbors probably thought I was a hermit. They weren't entirely wrong. After 8 or 9 hours of pretending to be someone I wasn't, home was where I could finally exhale, where I could stim freely, where I could spend hours reading about my special interests without anyone suggesting I needed to get out more or live a little. My family meant well, but they didn't understand. My parents, first-generation immigrants from Taiwan who had built successful careers in Boston's medical community, saw my quirks as obstacles to overcome rather than fundamental parts of who I was. My father, Dr. James Chun, was a respected cardiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital. My mother, Dr. Linda Chun, ran a thriving pediatric practice in Brookline. They were brilliant, accomplished people who had worked incredibly hard to build a life in America, and they wanted the same success for their only son. The problem was, their definition of success required me to be someone I wasn't. Every family dinner at their house near Coolidge Corner became an exercise in performance art. I'd practice conversations in my car before going inside, rehearsing responses to their inevitable questions about my social life, my career prospects, whether I'd met anyone special. They'd pepper me with advice about networking, about putting myself out there, about the importance of making connections in Boston's tight-knit professional community. What they didn't understand was that their well-meaning suggestions felt like requests to fundamentally alter my neural wiring. Asking me to enjoy networking events was like asking someone to enjoy having their skin slowly peeled off. Suggesting I join a recreational sports league or attend after-work happy hours felt like being told to breathe underwater. I could do it for short periods, but it wasn't sustainable, and it certainly wasn't enjoyable. So I developed coping strategies. I became an expert at masking, at mimicking the social behaviors I observed in neurotypical people. I learned to make small talk about the Red Sox and the weather, to laugh at jokes I didn't find funny, to pretend interest in topics that bored me to tears. I practiced maintaining appropriate eye contact, modulating my voice to sound more animated, suppressing my natural tendency to infodump about subjects I was passionate about. The mask worked to a degree. My colleagues saw me as quiet but competent, perhaps a bit eccentric but harmlessly so. My parents' friends would tell them what a polite, well-educated young man I was. But the effort was exhausting, and the loneliness was crushing. I felt like an actor playing a role in a show that would never end, surrounded by people but fundamentally alone. That was my life until that October evening in Boston Common, until I saw her sitting on that bench with her sketchbook, until everything I thought I knew about love and connection got turned upside down. Her name was Sarah Catherine Murphy, though I didn't learn that until later. What I learned first was that she had a way of tilting her head when she was concentrating, letting her hair fall forward to create a private curtain around her work. I learned that she chewed on the end of her pencil when she was thinking, leaving tiny indentations in the yellow paint. I learned that she wore the same brown leather jacket every day, soft and worn like an old friend. For 3 weeks, I saw her in the Common almost every evening around 6:30. I'd finish work, take the T from downtown crossing to Park Street, and walk the familiar path past the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, past the bronze figures of the Make Way for Duckling statues, to the spot where I'd first noticed her. She was always there, always sketching, always absorbed in her own world. I wanted to approach her, but the thought of disrupting her focus felt almost sacrilegious. Plus, my track record with romantic interactions was complicated. The few times I'd tried dating, things had gone poorly. Dinner conversations would lag when I couldn't think of anything to say about topics that didn't interest me. I'd miss social cues, misinterpret flirtation, or overwhelm potential partners with lengthy explanations of whatever subject had captured my attention that week. The worst had been with Jessica, a marketing manager I'd met at a work function 2 years earlier. She was beautiful and successful, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We went on 4 dates, and I thought things were going well. Then she told me, as gently as possible, that I was a really nice guy, but that dating me felt like work. She said I was too intense, too literal, that I made conversations feel like interviews rather than natural exchanges. Her words had stung, not because they were cruel, she'd actually been quite kind in her delivery, but because they confirmed what I'd always suspected about myself. I was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of effortless social connection that others seemed to take for granted. I was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed, only hidden. So I watched Sarah from a distance, creating elaborate fantasies about approaching her, about somehow finding the perfect thing to say that would make her look up from her sketchbook with interest rather than annoyance. I imagined conversations where my quirks would be charming rather than off-putting, where my intense focus would be seen as passion rather than obsession. The fantasy was safer than the reality. In my imagination, I could be the version of myself I'd always wanted to be: confident, charming, neurotypical. In real life, I was just David, the guy who counted steps as he walked, who had strong opinions about the superiority of mechanical pencils over traditional ones, who could spend hours discussing the architectural details of Boston's brownstone buildings but struggled to make casual conversation about weekend plans. Everything changed on a Thursday evening in late October. The temperature had dropped significantly, and most of the usual common visitors had headed indoors for warmth. I'd almost skipped my usual walk, but something drew me out anyway. Maybe the hope that she'd be there despite the cold, maybe just the need to maintain my routine. She was there, but something was different. Instead of her usual focused sketching, she was sitting with her journal closed in her lap, staring out at the pond with an expression I recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who was overwhelmed, overstimulated, barely holding it together. Her hands were clenched tightly around the journal, knuckles white with tension. As I watched, a group of college students walked by, their voices loud and full of that particular brand of enthusiasm that comes from youth and alcohol. One of them, a tall guy in a Red Sox cap, noticed Sarah sitting alone and decided to be friendly. "Hey there, beautiful," he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet space. "What are you drawing? Mind if we take a look?" Sarah's entire body went rigid. She shook her head without looking up, clutching her journal tighter. "Ah, come on," the guy persisted, stepping closer. His friends were laughing, encouraging him. "Don't be shy. I bet you're super talented. Art students usually are." I said no, Sarah said quietly, but her voice was barely audible. The guy either didn't hear her or chose to ignore her response. He moved even closer, and I could see Sarah beginning to shake. Not from cold, but from the kind of sensory overload I knew intimately. The feeling of being trapped when all you want is space and quiet and for the world to just stop pressing in on you. I found myself moving before I'd consciously decided to act. My usual social anxiety was overwhelmed by a more primitive instinct: the recognition of someone in distress who needed help. "Excuse me," I said, walking up to the group. My voice was steadier than I felt. "I think the lady asked to be left alone." The Red Sox cap guy turned to look at me, taking in my slight build, my nervous fidgeting with the stress ball in my pocket. "And who are you?" "Her boyfriend." I could have said yes. It might have been the easiest way to end the confrontation. But something about the way Sarah was sitting, the way she was trying to make herself smaller, reminded me too much of my own experiences of being cornered and overwhelmed. "I'm someone who understands that no means no," I said, meeting his gaze despite the way my heart was hammering in my chest. "She asked you to leave her alone. Please respect that." The tension stretched between us for several long seconds. The guy's friends were watching, waiting to see if this would escalate into something more dramatic. But there must have been something in my voice, or maybe he just wasn't drunk enough to start a fight over a stranger, because he finally shrugged and turned away. "Whatever, man. Her loss." They walked off toward Charles Street, their voices fading into the general noise of the city. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. Sarah was still sitting with her head down, still gripping her journal like a lifeline. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly, staying far enough away to not feel threatening but close enough that she could hear me. She looked up for the first time, and I saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. But there was something else there too: recognition. Not of me specifically, but of something familiar. "You stim too," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear. I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Your hand," she said, nodding toward my pocket where I was unconsciously working the stress ball between my fingers. "You stim. Like me." She held up her free hand, showing me a small piece of smooth stone that she was rubbing between her thumb and forefinger. It was worn smooth from what looked like years of handling. "Oh," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. Yes. I guess I do." We looked at each other for a long moment, and something passed between us that I'd never experienced before. It was like she was seeing past all the careful masks I wore, straight to the parts of myself I kept hidden. And instead of judgment or pity, I saw understanding. "I'm Sarah," she said eventually. "David," I replied. "Would you? I mean, if you want company. Would it be okay if I sat down? I promise I won't ask about your sketches or anything. Sometimes it just helps to have someone nearby who gets it." She considered this for a moment, then nodded and scooted over slightly on the bench. I sat down, leaving plenty of space between us, and we settled into a surprisingly comfortable silence. The pond stretched out in front of us, dark water reflecting the lights beginning to twinkle on in the buildings surrounding the common. After a while, Sarah spoke again. "Thank you for stepping in. I was having trouble finding words. When I get overwhelmed, sometimes the verbal processing just stops working." I nodded. "I know the feeling. Though for me it's usually the opposite. When I'm stressed, I either can't talk at all or I can't stop talking. There's no middle ground." She smiled slightly. "Autism. Never officially diagnosed," I admitted. "But yeah, probably." "You?" "Diagnosed at 23, she said. Took forever because I'm a girl and I learned to mask early. Apparently I was too good at pretending to be normal." The word pretending hit me like a physical blow. It was such a perfect description of how I'd spent most of my adult life, and hearing someone else say it out loud made something tight in my chest begin to loosen. "The masking is exhausting," I said quietly. "God, yes," Sarah replied, and there was such relief in her voice. "Some days I feel like I've been holding my breath for 8 hours straight. Like I'm performing in a play where everyone else was given the script but me." We sat there as the sky darkened, trading small observations about our experiences. Sarah told me about her work as a freelance illustrator, how she specialized in children's book illustrations because she could work from home and set her own hours. I told her about my job in software development, how I'd found a niche in debugging, because my attention to detail and pattern recognition skills were actually valued in that context. Neither of us talked about families or dating or the kinds of topics that usually dominated getting to know you conversations. Instead, we talked about sensory preferences. How Sarah couldn't stand the texture of cotton balls but found velvet soothing, how I had to wear noise-canceling headphones on the T during rush hour, how we both found crowded spaces physically painful in a way that was hard to explain to people who didn't experience it. It was the most honest conversation I'd had with another person in years. Maybe ever. As the evening grew later and colder, Sarah finally closed her sketchbook completely and stood up. "I should head home," she said. "But this was really nice. Thank you. Maybe I'll see you here again?" I asked, trying to keep the hopeful note out of my voice. She smiled, and it was the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen on her face all evening. "Yeah, I'd like that." She walked away toward the Park Street station, her brown jacket disappearing into the crowd of commuters. I sat on the bench for a few more minutes, processing what had just happened. For the first time in my adult life, I'd had a conversation where I hadn't felt like I was performing, where I hadn't needed to monitor my tone of voice or worry about making too much or too little eye contact, where I could just be myself, quirks and all, and be accepted. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next evening, I found myself walking to the common with an anticipation I hadn't felt in years. Sarah was there, sitting on our bench. Because somehow, in the space of one conversation, it had become our bench. She waved when she saw me, a small gesture that made my heart do something complicated in my chest. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," she said as I sat down beside her. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to," I replied honestly. She considered this, turning her smooth stone over in her fingers. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About the masking being exhausting. I realized that yesterday was the first time in months that I'd had a conversation where I didn't feel like I was translating everything through some kind of neurotypical filter before speaking. I knew exactly what she meant. It's like having to speak a foreign language all the time, even though it's supposedly your native tongue." "Yes, exactly." Her eyes lit up with recognition. "And then you get home and you're so mentally drained that you can barely function for the rest of the evening." We fell into an easy rhythm over the following week. Every evening after work, we'd meet at the bench in the common. Sometimes we'd talk, sharing stories about our day or observations about the world around us. Sometimes we'd sit in comfortable silence, Sarah sketching while I read or just watched the people passing by. I learned that Sarah lived in a studio apartment in the North End, above a bakery that filled her mornings with the scent of fresh bread. She'd moved to Boston from a small town in Vermont for college and had never left, drawn by the city's combination of history and anonymity. She could disappear into the crowds when she needed to, but there was also something comforting about the constancy of the place. The way the Freedom Trail would always follow the same path, the way the swan boats would always circle the same pond, the way Faneuil Hall would always buzz with the same chaotic energy. She learned that I'd grown up in the Boston suburbs, the product of two highly successful parents who loved me but didn't quite know what to do with me. That I'd chosen software development because it allowed me to work with logical systems that had predictable outcomes, unlike human interactions which seemed governed by invisible rules that everyone else had learned but me. That I lived alone not because I was antisocial, but because solitude was how I recharged from the constant effort of navigating a world that wasn't designed for brains like mine. What struck me most about our conversations was how easy they were. With Sarah, I didn't have to perform normalcy. If I got excited about something and started talking faster, she didn't look at me like I was strange. If I needed a few extra seconds to process what she'd said before responding, she waited patiently instead of filling the silence with nervous chatter. If I stymied with my stress ball or tapped my fingers against my leg, she didn't comment or stare. In return, I learned to recognize her signals. When she got overwhelmed, she'd start pulling at her hair, twisting sections around her finger. When she was happy or excited about something, she'd rock slightly in her seat, a barely perceptible movement that I only noticed because I was paying attention. When she was processing something difficult, she'd go very still, staring off into the distance while her hand worked the smooth stone in her pocket. We developed our own communication shortcut. A particular tilt of the head meant, "I need a moment to think." A slight shift in posture meant, "This conversation is getting too intense." A soft touch to the arm meant, "I understand what you can't find words for." It was unlike any relationship I'd ever experienced, romantic or otherwise. There was an intimacy in being truly seen and accepted that was more profound than physical attraction. Though there was that too, building slowly beneath the foundation of understanding we were creating together. I found myself looking forward to our evening meetings with an intensity that probably would have worried me if I'd stopped to analyze it. But for once in my life, I didn't want to overthink something. I wanted to simply exist in the moment, to enjoy the unprecedented experience of connection without constantly questioning whether I was doing it right. Our first real date happened almost by accident. It was a particularly cold evening in November, and when I arrived at our usual spot, Sarah was shivering despite her heavy jacket. "The wind off the river is brutal tonight," she said through chattering teeth. Without thinking, I said, "There's a cafe on Beacon Street that's usually pretty quiet this time of night. They have good hot chocolate. Want to get warm?" She looked surprised, then pleased. "That sounds perfect." The Thinking Cup was one of my regular spots, a small cafe with dim lighting and plenty of corner tables where you could sit without being bothered. The barista knew me by sight but had never tried to engage me in conversation beyond taking my order. Exactly the kind of low-pressure environment I preferred. We found a table near the back, away from the handful of other customers. Sarah wrapped her hands around her mug of hot chocolate, closing her eyes as she breathed in the steam. "This is much better," she said. "Thank you for suggesting it." We talked for over 2 hours that night, our conversation ranging from childhood memories to career dreams to our shared love of obscure documentaries. I told her about my fascination with the architectural history of Boston, how I could walk the same streets and notice different details each time. The way Georgian and Federal-style buildings sat next to modern glass towers, creating a visual timeline of the city's evolution. She told me about her illustration work, how she'd fallen into children's books almost by accident but discovered she loved creating worlds where being different was celebrated rather than tolerated. Her characters were often outsiders or misfits who found their own kind of belonging, and I could hear the personal experience woven into her professional passion. "I've been working on this series about a girl who can hear colors," Sarah said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "To everyone else, she seems like she's not paying attention or responding appropriately to what they're saying. But really, she's overwhelmed by all the extra sensory information she's processing." "That sounds like a metaphor for neurodivergence," I observed. "Not a metaphor," Sarah said with a smile. "Just a different way of telling the truth." When the cafe began closing down around us, we reluctantly gathered our things and headed back out into the cold night. Sarah lived in the opposite direction from my Cambridge apartment, but I found myself offering to walk her to the North End station. "You don't have to do that," she said. "It's completely out of your way." "I want to," I replied and realized I meant it. Despite the cold, despite the crowds of late-night revelers that would be harder to navigate than our quiet cafe, I wanted to extend our time together. We walked slowly through the Boston Common, then up Washington Street toward Government Center. The city took on a different character at night, softer somehow, with the harsh edges of daytime commerce smoothed over by darkness and the warm glow of streetlights. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said as we passed the old State House. "Of course. Have you ever told your family? About being autistic, I mean. Even if it's not officially diagnosed." I was quiet for several steps, considering how to answer. "Not directly. I think they suspect something, but they've always framed it in terms of me being shy or antisocial or too focused on work. They see it as a phase I'll grow out of, or a personality flaw I can fix with the right motivation." "That sounds lonely." "It is," I admitted. "They love me, but they love the version of me they think I could become if I just tried harder. They don't love who I actually am, because they don't really know who that is." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, "My family had the opposite reaction when I was diagnosed. Total denial. They insisted the doctors were wrong, that I was just sensitive or creative or going through a difficult phase. They still introduce me to people as their artistic daughter, like that explains away all the ways I don't fit their expectations." We'd reached the entrance to her station. The late-night tea schedule meant she'd have a bit of a wait for the next train, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to end the conversation. "It's strange," I said, "how much energy we spend trying to be acceptable to people who claim to love us unconditionally." "Maybe that's why this feels so different," Sarah replied softly. "With you, I don't feel like I need to be acceptable. I can just be honest." She stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell her shampoo, something light and floral that didn't overwhelm my sensitive nose. For a moment I thought she might kiss me, and I realized I wanted her to. But instead, she reached out and briefly touched my hand. "Thank you for tonight. And for walking me here. And for..." She gestured vaguely, as if encompassing everything that had happened between us over the past few weeks. "Thank you for letting me," I said. She smiled and disappeared down the steps into the station. I stood there for several minutes after she'd gone, replaying the evening in my mind, trying to process the complex mixture of emotions I was experiencing. Happiness, definitely. Anticipation. But also a growing fear that I was setting myself up for disappointment. Because the truth was, I was falling in love with Sarah Murphy. Not the careful, controlled attraction I'd felt for other women, where I'd analyzed compatibility and weighed pros and cons. This was something deeper and more immediate, a recognition that felt almost cellular in its certainty. And that terrified me. Because in my experience, love meant making yourself vulnerable to people who ultimately couldn't accept the full truth of who you were. Love meant trying to be someone else's version of perfect, then failing when the mask inevitably slipped. But with Sarah, for the first time, I could imagine a different kind of love. One based on truth rather than performance, on acceptance rather than improvement project. It was a beautiful possibility, but it was also one I'd never seen modeled in my own life. Over the following weeks, Sarah and I continued to meet, though now our time together extended beyond our bench in the common. We took long walks along the Charles River, watching the rowers from Harvard and MIT cut through the water in their sleek shells. We wandered through the stacks at the Boston Public Library, sharing book recommendations and marveling at the ornate architecture of the McKim Building. We discovered we both loved the Museum of Science, but for different reasons. Sarah was drawn to the interactive exhibits, the way they made abstract concepts tangible and immediate. I was fascinated by the planetarium, the way the controlled environment allowed me to experience the wonder of the cosmos without the unpredictability of social interaction. We spent an entire afternoon in the Blue Wing, talking about everything and nothing while surrounded by the quiet hum of learning. It was there, sitting on a bench beneath a suspended model of the solar system, that Sarah first told me she was falling in love with me. She said it quietly, almost as an afterthought to some observation about the way light moved through the museum's glass walls. "I think I'm falling in love with you, David. Is that okay?" I was so surprised by the directness of her statement that I actually laughed. "Is it okay?" "Sarah, I've been in love with you for weeks." I was just too scared to say anything. "Why scared?" I gestured around us, at the families with young children, the couples holding hands, the teenagers on school field trip. "Look at them. They all make it seem so easy. Love, relationships, connection. For people like us, it's more complicated, isn't it? There are more ways for things to go wrong." Sarah considered this, absently playing with her worry stone. "Maybe. But maybe there are also more ways for things to go right. Maybe when you find someone who really understands you, the connection is deeper than what neurotypical people usually experience." "You think so?" "I hope so," she said. "I guess we'll find out." She reached for my hand, and I let her take it, marveling at how right it felt. Her fingers were long and slender, artist's hands with small calluses from holding pencils and paintbrushes. She traced patterns on my palm as we sat there, a gentle stemming behavior that was surprisingly soothing. "David," she said eventually, "would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? A real dinner, at my apartment. I'll cook, and we can talk, and maybe we can figure out what this is between us." My immediate instinct was to say yes, but then the practical concerns kicked in. What about sensory issues? Cooking smells, unfamiliar environment, change in routine. I was thinking something simple. Pasta with garlic and olive oil, very mild flavors. I have soft lighting and good acoustic. And if you get overwhelmed, we can always take breaks or change the plan. The fact that she'd already thought through the potential challenges made my chest tight with affection. "Yes," I said. "I'd love to have dinner with you." That night, I lay awake thinking about what it meant to be in love with someone who truly understood me. I'd spent so many years believing that my neurodivergence made me fundamentally unlovable, that my quirks and needs would always be burdens for potential partners to bear. But with Sarah, those same traits were simply facts about me, neither good nor bad, just part of the complete picture of who I was. It was a revelation that felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Because if I could be loved as I truly was, that meant I no longer had any excuse to hide behind masks and performances. It meant I would have to be brave enough to show up authentically, even when that felt vulnerable or risky. The next evening, I took the T to the North End, navigating the narrow cobblestone streets that gave this part of Boston its old-world charm. Sarah's building was tucked between an Italian restaurant and a vintage bookstore, the kind of neighborhood where you could walk to everything you needed but still feel like you were living in a secret corner of the city. She answered her door in jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her apartment was small but perfectly organized, with warm lighting and carefully chosen furniture that prioritized comfort over style. The walls were covered with her artwork, illustrations in various stages of completion, sketches of Boston landmarks, character studies for her children's book projects. "This is beautiful," I said, taking in the space that was so clearly an extension of her personality. "It's my sanctuary," she replied. "The only place where I never have to mask." She'd prepared exactly what she'd promised: simple pasta with garlic, olive oil, and fresh herbs, served with a side of roasted vegetables and crusty bread from the bakery downstairs. The flavors were subtle and comforting, nothing that would overwhelm sensitive taste buds. We ate at her small table by the window, which looked out over the narrow street below. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences as we watched people walking by, tourists heading to the Old North Church, locals coming home from work, a group of college students looking for authentic Italian food. After dinner, we moved to her small living room, sitting together on a comfortable couch that faced away from the street noise. Sarah had dimmed the lights and lit a few candles, creating an atmosphere that felt intimate without being overwhelming. "Can I ask you something that might be too personal?" Sarah said, curling her legs underneath her. "You can ask me anything. What do you want, David? I mean, when you think about the future, about relationships, about love, what do you actually want, not what you think you should want?" It was a question I'd never been asked so directly, and it took me a moment to formulate an honest answer. "I want to stop pretending," I said finally. "I want to be with someone where I can be myself completely, where my need for routine and quiet and processing time isn't seen as a limitation but just as part of who I am. I want someone who understands that when I get excited about something and talk for 20 minutes about Boston's subway system or the history of programming languages, it's because I'm sharing something I love, not because I'm trying to be difficult." I paused, then continued. "I want someone who knows that when I need to leave a party early or skip a social event entirely, it's not because I don't care about them but because I'm taking care of myself so I can show up fully when it matters. I want love that doesn't require me to be anyone other than who I am." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I want the same thing. And I think maybe we can give that to each other." She moved closer to me on the couch, close enough that our knees were touching. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that first night about masking being exhausting. I realized that I've been masking in every relationship I've ever been in, romantic or otherwise. Even with people I cared about, even with people who cared about me. I was always performing some version of myself that I thought would be more acceptable. What would it look like if we didn't do that?" I asked. "If we just were ourselves?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I'd like to find out." She reached for my hand again, and this time I didn't hesitate to intertwine our fingers. We sat there for a while, not talking, just being present with each other. The silence wasn't uncomfortable or charged with expectation. It was simply peaceful, the kind of quiet companionship I'd always craved but never quite managed to find. Eventually, Sarah spoke again. "David, I need to tell you something. About my family." Something in her tone made me look at her more closely. "What about them?" They have very specific ideas about what my life should look like. Who I should be with, how I should behave, what kind of future I should want. When I was diagnosed with autism, they didn't handle it well. They've spent the last few years trying to convince me that I can overcome it if I just try harder. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "And they're coming for Thanksgiving next week. My parents and my older brother, they always grill me about my social life, about whether I'm dating anyone, about when I'm going to settle down and give them grandchildren. Normal family stuff, I guess, but they want the neurotypical version of you to show up for those conversations. Exactly. And I'm tired of it, David. I'm tired of pretending to be someone I'm not, even for people I love. Especially for people I love. I could hear the weight of years of frustration and loneliness in her voice. It was the same weight I carried, the exhaustion of constantly performing normalcy for people who claimed to want the best for you but couldn't accept who you actually were. What are you going to do? I asked. I want to tell them about you, about us, but I also want to tell them the truth about who I am, about what autism actually means in my life instead of their sanitized version of it. I want to stop apologizing for needing the things I need. The prospect of meeting Sarah's family filled me with dread, but I could also hear how important this was to her. Do you want me there? When you tell them? Would you? I know it's a lot to ask, especially since we've only just… we haven't even… She gestured vaguely between us, and I realized she was right. We'd talked about love, we'd acknowledged our feelings for each other, but we hadn't actually defined what we were to each other. Sarah, I said, turning to face her fully. I love you. I'm in love with you. I want to be with you, whatever that means, however that looks. If you want me to meet your family, if you want me to be there when you tell them about us, then I want to be there. The relief on her face was immediate and profound. I love you too. And yes, I want you there. I want them to see that being autistic doesn't mean being alone or unfulfilled. I want them to meet someone who loves me exactly as I am. She leaned forward and kissed me then, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as I kissed her back. It was my first kiss that didn't feel like a performance, my first kiss where I wasn't monitoring my technique or worrying about whether I was doing it right. It was just connection, pure and simple. When we finally broke apart, Sarah rested her forehead against mine. This is terrifying, she whispered. Good terrifying or bad terrifying? Good terrifying. Like jumping off a cliff when you're pretty sure you can fly. I knew exactly what she meant. The week leading up to Thanksgiving was a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Sarah and I spent more time together, as if we were storing up connection before the challenge of facing her family. We took long walks along the Freedom Trail, talking through what she planned to say, how she wanted to frame our relationship, what she hoped the outcome would be. I don't need them to understand everything, she told me as we stood outside the Old North Church, watching tourists take pictures and trying to imagine what it had been like on that historic night in 1775. I just need them to respect that this is my life and these are my choices. I need them to accept that I'm not broken, just different. And if they can't do that? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then I guess I'll know where we stand. And I'll have to decide what kind of relationship I can have with people who can't accept who I really am. The weight of that possibility hung between us. Family relationships are complicated under the best of circumstances, but when you add neurodivergence into the mix, they become minefields of misunderstanding and good intentions gone wrong. I knew from my own experience how painful it could be to love people who couldn't love you back in the way you needed. Thanksgiving Day arrived gray and cold, with the kind of raw November wind that cuts right through your jacket and makes you want to stay indoors. Sarah had invited her family for dinner at 3, which meant we had the morning to ourselves and most of the afternoon to prepare both the meal and ourselves for what was sure to be a difficult conversation. I arrived at her apartment around 10, carrying flowers and a bottle of wine and a level of nervous energy that made it hard to sit still. Sarah was in full preparation mode, cooking and cleaning and organizing with the kind of focused intensity one recognized as a coping mechanism for anxiety. "They'll be here in 4 hours," she said, checking something in the oven for the third time in 10 minutes. "The turkey is fine, the sides are prepped, the apartment looks good. I think we're ready. Are you ready?" I asked, because meal preparation was the easy part. She stopped moving for the first time since I'd arrived, standing in the middle of her small kitchen with her hands on her hips, staring at nothing in particular. "I've been masking for them my entire life," she said quietly. "My whole childhood was learning to be the daughter they wanted instead of the daughter I was. Smiling when I wanted to retreat, engaging in conversations that felt like sensory torture, participating in family activities that overwhelmed me completely because that's what normal families do." She looked at me then, and I could see the depth of her exhaustion. "I can't do it anymore, David. I can't pretend to be someone else just to make them comfortable. Even if it means losing them." I wanted to offer reassurance, to tell her that everything would be fine, that her family would surprise us both with their acceptance and understanding. But I'd lived with well-meaning family members my entire life, and I knew that love and acceptance weren't always the same thing. Instead, I said, "Whatever happens, you won't be alone. I'll be right there with you." She came over and hugged me then, burying her face against my shoulder. I could feel some of the tension leave her body as she allowed herself to be supported. "Thank you," she said, "for understanding why this matters so much. For being willing to walk into this with me." At exactly 3 o'clock, the buzzer rang. Sarah took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and went to let her family up. I heard them before I saw them, voices carrying up the narrow stairwell, her mother talking about traffic and parking, her father commenting on the neighborhood, her brother complaining about something work-related. They sounded like any normal family arriving for Thanksgiving dinner, which somehow made it even more surreal. Sarah opened the door, and suddenly the small apartment was filled with people and energy, and the kind of bustling activity that made my skin crawl. Her mother, Patricia, was a compact woman with Sarah's dark hair and an efficient way of moving that suggested someone used to managing multiple tasks simultaneously. Her father, Robert, was tall and distinguished, with the kind of authoritative presence that probably served him well in his career as a corporate lawyer. Her brother Michael was somewhere in between, carrying himself with the casual confidence of someone who'd always fit easily into the world's expectations. "Sarah, sweetheart," Patricia said, pulling her daughter into a hug that went on slightly too long. "You look wonderful. Have you been eating enough? You seem thin." "I'm fine, Mom. Really." Sarah extracted herself from the embrace and gestured toward me. "I want you to meet David. David Chun, this is my family." I stepped forward, extending my hand in what I hoped was an appropriately confident manner. Robert shook it firmly, making the kind of sustained eye contact that I knew was supposed to convey trustworthiness but just made me uncomfortable. "David," he said, "Sarah's told us absolutely nothing about you, so we're very curious." "She's been very secretive lately," Patricia added, looking between us with a kind of speculative expression that suggested she was already drawing conclusions. "Are you two dating?" I looked at Sarah, waiting for her lead. This was her family, her conversation to navigate. "We'll talk about that over dinner," Sarah said diplomatically. "Why don't you sit down and I'll get you something to drink?" The next hour passed in a blur of small talk and meal preparation. I found myself largely observing the family dynamics, the way they communicated in shorthand developed over decades of shared history. Patricia dominated most conversations, filling any potential silence with questions or observations. Robert made periodic pronouncements about current events or work situations, clearly used to being the final authority on most topics. Michael contributed a steady stream of gentle teasing directed at Sarah, the kind of sibling dynamic that was probably affectionate but felt slightly aggressive to my sensitive social radar. Sarah moved through it all with a smile that looked increasingly strained as the afternoon wore on. I could see her stimmying more frequently, touching her worry stone, adjusting her hair, tapping her fingers against her leg in patterns only I would recognize as self-regulation rather than nervous habit. Dinner was delicious and tense in equal measure. The conversation ranged over safe topics, work, weather, neighborhood changes, mutual family friends. But I could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging over the table, the curiosity about who I was and what I meant to Sarah. Finally, as we were finishing the main course, Patricia decided to address the elephant in the room. "So, David," she said, setting down her fork and giving me her full attention, "what do you do? How did you and Sarah meet? We're just dying to know more about you." I could feel Sarah tense beside me. We'd talked about this moment, but being in the middle of it felt different than planning for it. "I'm a software engineer," I said. "I work for a tech company downtown. Sarah and I met in Boston Common, actually. She was sketching, and I was admiring her focus." "How romantic," Patricia said, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "And how long have you been seeing each other?" "About 2 months," Sarah answered before I could respond. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you. All of you." The change in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. The casual dinner conversation was over, and something more serious was beginning. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" Sarah took a deep breath, and I could see her gathering courage. "I want to talk about my autism diagnosis, about what it actually means in my life, and how it affects my relationships." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's smile faltered slightly. Robert set down his wine glass with careful precision. Michael looked confused, as if he wasn't sure why this topic was coming up again. "Sarah," Patricia said carefully, "we've talked about this. You're not really autistic, honey. You're just sensitive and creative. There's nothing wrong with you that you need to define yourself by some label." "But I am autistic, Mom. It's not a label, it's a neurological reality. And it affects everything about how I experience the world, including how I connect with other people." "Sweetheart," Robert interjected, "you're successful, you're talented, you live independently. You don't need to limit yourself with these kinds of diagnoses." I could see Sarah's hands shaking slightly as she reached for her water glass. This was going exactly as she'd feared it would, but she pressed on. "I'm not limiting myself. I'm trying to be honest about who I am. And part of who I am is someone who needs certain accommodations and understanding. David gets that." 3 pairs of eyes turned to me, and I felt like I was being evaluated for some test I didn't know I was taking. "How so?" Michael asked, his tone neutral but skeptical. I looked at Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "We were in this together." "Because I'm autistic too," I said simply. I understand what Sarah means about masking, about how exhausting it is to constantly translate yourself for other people's comfort. I understand why she needs quiet time and why certain social situations are overwhelming and why she's so passionate about her special interests. The silence this time was even more profound. I could hear the clock ticking on Sarah's mantelpiece, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the hum of the refrigerator in her small kitchen. "You're both." Patricia started, then stopped, as if she couldn't quite find the words. "We're both autistic," Sarah confirmed. "And we love each other. Not in spite of our neurodivergence, but including it. David loves that I get completely absorbed in my artwork, that I notice details other people miss, that I think differently about problems. I love that he can talk for hours about things he's passionate about, that he's incredibly observant, that he's direct and honest in ways that most people aren't." "But what about the future?" Robert asked, his lawyer's mind immediately jumping to practical concerns. "What about marriage, children, building a normal life together? What makes you think our life wouldn't be normal?" I asked, genuinely curious about his assumptions. "Well, I mean..." He gestured vaguely, as if the challenges were obvious. "The social limitations, the communication issues, the need for special accommodations. How would you manage careers, family obligations, raising children?" I felt a familiar surge of frustration, the same feeling I got when people assumed that being different meant being less capable. "Mr. Murphy," I said, trying to keep my voice level, I have a successful career in software development. I manage my own finances, maintain my own home, have meaningful friendship. Sarah runs her own freelance illustration business and has clients all over the country. We communicate better than most couples I know because we're honest about our needs instead of expecting each other to read our minds. As for children, Sarah added, there's nothing about being autistic that makes someone a bad parent. In fact, many of the traits that come with autism, attention to detail, deep empathy, strong pattern recognition, intense focus on things we care about, those could actually make us really good parents. Patricia was shaking her head slowly, as if she was trying to process information that didn't fit her worldview. I just don't understand, she said. You're both so high-functioning. Why do you need to focus on these limitations? Why can't you just live your lives without making everything about this diagnosis? Because, Sarah said, and I could hear the years of frustration breaking through her careful composure, pretending to be neurotypical is killing me. Do you know what it's like to come home from family gatherings so drained that I can't function for the rest of the day? Do you know what it's like to feel like I'm failing some test every time we have a conversation because I can't read between the lines the way you want me to? Her voice was rising, and I could see the emotional overwhelm building. I reached for her hand under the table, offering what grounding I could. Do you know what it's like, she continued, to feel like the people who are supposed to love you most are constantly disappointed in who you actually are? The words hung in the air like an accusation. Patricia's face crumpled slightly, and I could see that Sarah's pain was genuine news to her. Honey, we're not disappointed in you. We love you exactly as you are. No, Sarah said firmly. You love the version of me that I perform for you. You love the Sarah who smiles and makes small talk and pretends that family gatherings don't overwhelm her sensory system. You love the Sarah who goes along with your plans and doesn't mention when social situations are painful for her. You've never met the real me. Michael spoke for the first time in several minutes. So who's the real you? It was a simple question, but I could see that it caught Sarah off guard. She'd been preparing to defend her diagnosis, to explain her needs, to justify her relationship with me. She hadn't necessarily prepared to articulate who she was when she wasn't masking. The real me, she said slowly, is someone who feels music in colors and sees patterns in everything. Someone who can spend 6 hours straight drawing the same flower from different angles because I'm fascinated by the way light changes the shadows. Someone who would rather have one deep conversation than 10 shallow ones. Someone who needs time alone to recharge, not because I don't love people, but because feeling everything as intensely as I do is exhausting. She looked at me, then back at her family. The real me is someone who found a person who understands all of that and loves me because of it, not in spite of it. Someone who doesn't make me apologize for needing the things I need. Robert was quiet for a long moment, turning his wine glass in careful circles on the table. I'm trying to understand, he said finally. But this is not the future we imagined for you, Sarah. What future did you imagine? She asked. A normal one, Patricia said softly. A husband who could take care of you, children, a house in a nice neighborhood. Stability. Security. And you don't think I can have those things with David? They looked at me again, and I realized they were seeing me through the lens of their fears rather than any actual evidence of my character or capabilities. It's not about David specifically, Robert said carefully. It's about, well, if you're both dealing with these challenges, how do you support each other? What happens when you both get overwhelmed at the same time? What about social obligations, professional networking, the kinds of things that require flexibility? I understood what he was really asking. He was asking whether two autistic people could build a sustainable life together, whether we could navigate a world that wasn't designed for us without burning out or failing in the ways that mattered to society. Mr. Murphy, I said, can I tell you about my parents? He nodded. They're both doctors. Highly successful, well-respected in their field. They love me deeply, but they've spent my entire life trying to help me be more normal. More social, more flexible, more neurotypical. They had the same concerns you're expressing now. I paused, trying to find the right words. But here's what they didn't understand, and what I'm hoping you might. The energy I spent trying to be someone I'm not was energy I couldn't spend building the life I actually wanted. Every hour I spent practicing small talk or forcing myself to enjoy parties or pretending that sensory overload wasn't a real issue was an hour I couldn't spend developing my actual strengths or pursuing genuine connections. Sarah squeezed my hand under the table, encouraging me to continue. With Sarah, I don't have to waste that energy. We can build a life that works for both of us, that accommodates our needs instead of fighting against them. That's not limiting, it's liberating. But what about children? Patricia asked. What if you pass these traits on to them? Then we'll love them exactly as they are, Sarah said without hesitation. And we'll make sure they never feel like they need to apologize for being themselves. The conversation continued for another hour, circling through the same concerns and explanations from different angles. Patricia worried about social isolation. Robert questioned our career prospect. Michael seemed genuinely curious but struggled to understand why we couldn't just work around our neurodivergent trait. Throughout it all, I watched Sarah navigate the emotional minefield with increasing confidence. She didn't back down from her truth, but she also didn't attack her family for their misconceptions. She simply, persistently, insisted on being seen and accepted as she actually was. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade outside her windows, Robert asked the question that had been lurking beneath all the others. What do you need from us, Sarah? What are you asking us to do? Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could see her considering her answer carefully. I need you to stop trying to fix me, she said finally. I need you to understand that being autistic isn't a tragedy or a limitation. It's just a different way of being human. I need you to respect my choices about how I live my life and who I choose to love. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each family member. I need you to get to know the real me, not the version I've been performing for you. And I need you to trust that David and I can build a beautiful life together, even if it doesn't look exactly like the one you imagined for me. Patricia was crying quietly, tears rolling down her cheeks as she looked at her daughter. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry if we made you feel like you had to hide who you are. We were just trying to help you succeed, to make sure you had every opportunity. I know, Mom, but success for me might look different than success for other people. And that's okay. Robert reached across the table and took Sarah's free hand. We love you, sweetheart. It may take us some time to understand all of this, but we love you. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still questions, still concerns, still a fundamental gap in understanding that would take time and patience to bridge. But it was a beginning. For the first time, Sarah's family was seeing her as she actually was instead of as they wished she could be. As they prepared to leave, Patricia pulled me aside in Sarah's small entryway. David, she said quietly, I need to know that you'll take care of her, that you understand how special she is. Mrs. Murphy, I replied, Sarah doesn't need taking care of. She needs someone who loves and respects her exactly as she is. That's what I do. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly. I think maybe you're right. After her family left, Sarah and I sat on her couch in the growing darkness, emotionally drained but oddly peaceful. We'd survived the conversation, and while it hadn't gone perfectly, it had gone honestly. How do you feel? I asked. Tired, she said immediately. But also lighter, somehow. Like I've been holding my breath for 28 years, and I can finally exhale. She curled up against my side, and I wrapped my arms around her, marveling at how right it felt to hold someone who didn't need me to be anyone other than myself. What happens now? I asked. Now we build the life we want, she said. Not the life anyone else thinks we should want. The life that actually works for us. Over the following months, that's exactly what we did. We established routines that honored both of our needs for structure and predictability. We created a shared language for communicating about sensory overload, social exhaustion, and the need for processing time. We learned each other's stims and comfort strategies, becoming a support system that understood neurodivergence from the inside. Our relationship wasn't without challenges. There were days when we were both overwhelmed and couldn't offer each other the emotional regulation we needed. There were social situations that tested our ability to advocate for our needs while maintaining important relationships. There were moments when the weight of being different in a neurotypical world felt almost too heavy to bear. But there were also moments of joy that I'd never experienced before. Conversations that lasted for hours because we were both genuinely interested in the topic and neither of us felt the need to perform appropriate levels of engagement. Comfortable silences that stretched for entire evenings, both of us absorbed in our own projects but connected by proximity and understanding. The deep satisfaction of being truly known by another person, quirks and needs and all. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, I asked Sarah to move in with me. Not because it was the next logical step in some predetermined relationship progression, but because we'd created something together that felt sustainable and joyful and real. A year after that, I proposed to her in the same spot where we'd first met, on that bench in Boston Common overlooking the pond. I didn't get down on one knee or make a grand speech. Instead, I simply told her that I wanted to spend the rest of my life building a world where both of us could be completely ourselves. She said yes, of course. But more importantly, she said, I want that too. Our wedding was small and carefully planned to accommodate our sensory needs and social preferences. We held it in the Boston Public Garden on a quiet Thursday morning in May, with only immediate family and a few close friends in attendance. The ceremony was short and focused on the promises we were making to each other rather than performance for an audience. Sarah's family came, and while they were still learning to understand our relationship, they were making an effort. Patricia had even asked me about my special interests and listened with genuine curiosity as I explained my fascination with urban architecture. Robert had begun recommending articles about neurodivergence in the workplace, trying to educate himself about our experiences. My parents attended too, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like they were seeing me as I actually was rather than as they wished I could become. The wedding was undeniably unconventional. We both wore noise-canceling headphones during the reception, we had a quiet room set up for anyone who needed a break from socializing, and we left early instead of staying late. But it was authentically us. As I write this, 3 years after that first conversation on a bench in Boston Common, Sarah and I are living in a small house in Somerville, just outside the city. We each have our own office spaces where we can work without interruption, but we also have common areas where we can be together when we want company. We've built a life that accommodates both of our needs without requiring either of us to sacrifice who we are. Sarah's illustration career has flourished, particularly her work creating representation for neurodivergent children in picture books. She recently signed a contract for a series about a girl who sees the world differently and the adventures that unique perspective leads her on. The books have been praised for their authentic portrayal of autism and their celebration of neurological diversity. My own career has evolved as well. I now work as a consultant, helping tech companies create more inclusive workplace environments for neurodivergent employees. It turns out that my lived experience with masking and sensory accommodation has given me insights that are valuable in professional settings. But more than our individual successes, we've built something together that I never thought possible, a love that doesn't require either of us to be anyone other than who we are. We have our routines and our rituals, our shared interests and our individual obsessions. We navigate family gatherings and social obligations as a team, supporting each other when things get overwhelming and celebrating the moments when everything clicks into place. We've talked about having children someday, And if we do, we'll raise them to understand that there are many ways to be human, that being different isn't something to be ashamed of or fixed. We'll teach them that love means accepting people completely, not just the parts that are easy or convenient. Most importantly, we've learned that unmasking isn't just about revealing your authentic self to others. It's about accepting yourself completely, needs and quirks and all. It's about recognizing that the things that make you different aren't flaws to be hidden but gifts to be celebrated. The love I wasn't allowed to feel turned out to be the love I was always meant to find. Not in spite of who I am, but because of who I am. And in a world that often tells neurodivergent people that they need to change to be worthy of love, that realization has been nothing short of revolutionary. So to anyone listening who has ever felt like they needed to hide their true self to be loved, who has ever believed that their neurodivergent traits made them unworthy of genuine connection, I want you to know this. You deserve love that celebrates who you are, not love that tolerates who you pretend to be. You deserve someone who understands that your need for routine isn't rigidity but self-care, that your intense interests aren't obsessions but passions, that your different way of processing the world isn't a limitation but a unique perspective worth sharing. The love you're looking for exists. The person who will see all of you and choose all of you is out there. And when you find them, when you find that connection that doesn't require performance or pretense, you'll understand what I learned on that bench in Boston Common. Being yourself isn't just enough, it's everything. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the streets of Boston, through the challenges of unmasking, through the discovery of love that transforms rather than tolerates. Remember that your story is worth telling, your authentic self is worth celebrating, and your capacity for love and connection is limitless when you have the courage to show up as you truly are. Until next time, be gentle with yourselves, be proud of who you are, and never stop believing in the possibility of love that sees you completely and chooses you anyway. That love is real, it's waiting for you, and you deserve nothing less.